Hello and welcome back as we dig into my favorite of the Narnia books, The Silver Chair. As I mentioned in this week's intro video, it has a lot of themes and symbols that I find to be deeply meaningful, and we'll talk about some of those along the way, and so let's just go ahead and jump right in. Now, as we've been doing, let's take a look here at the first paragraph of the book, because Lewis is always very intentional, and really any good storyteller, any good novelist is going to be very intentional about how they set up the first paragraph to bring you into the themes or to bring you into the line of thought that they're going to be drawing out for us. And so let's take a quick look at that. It was a dull autumn day, and Jill Pole was crying behind the gym. She was crying because they had been bullying her. This is not going to be a school story, so I shall say as little as possible about Jill's school, which is not a pleasant subject. It was coeducational, a school for both boys and girls, what used to be called a mixed school. Some said it was not nearly so mixed as the minds of the people who ran it. These people had the idea that boys and girls should be allowed to do what they liked, and unfortunately, what 10 or 15 of the biggest boys and girls liked best was bullying the others. All sorts of things, horrid things, went on which at an ordinary school would have been found out and stopped in half a term. But at this school, they weren't. Or even if they were, the people who did them were not expelled or punished. The head said they were interesting psychological cases, and sent for them and talked to them for hours. And if you knew the right sort of things to say to the head, the main result was that you became rather a favorite than otherwise. So Lewis is being very intentional about setting this up, not just at the beginning, but as the framing for the entire story that we're about to read. Now, what is the setup? Well, this school seems very nice. That is, NICE. It's even fully equipped with a head. Well, first, I should say that on a biographical level, Lewis himself seemed to have a very dreadful time at school. And for more on that, and sometimes to a disturbing degree, you can read that in Surprised by Joy, his spiritual autobiography. But bringing the focus more to Lewis's non-autobiographical writings, this school is very much meant to stand for the kind of progressivism that Lewis has continually been taking shots at throughout the stories that we've been reading. This is the school of Gaius and Titus of the Green Book, as discussed in The Abolition of Man. It's progressive without any clear sense of progress. It denies basic realities, such as the distinction between boys and girls. It's driven by sociology while not having any clear idea as to what it might even mean to be man. What is the good for a boy and a girl? What should we be guiding them into? And these kinds of transcendental questions are really off the table, and so it's progress for the sake of progress. And so there's no sense of justice, but only matter in motion, survival of the fittest, and politicking to get into the good favor with the head. And this is where the story begins and where it is headed. And while it is more than this, Lewis is letting the attentive reader know right away that this book is going to be a commentary on progressive education, but and even more so, the spirits behind progressive education, this empty secular progressivism as such. This is the abolition of man, or even that hideous strength, repackaged through myth designed for children. Now, on a more imminent level, we also see the despairing reality from which Jill and Eustace need escape. We see this empty, bland, really just desperate modernism in need of some re-enchanting. And Eustace tells Jill of Narnia, and they talk a little bit about how they might get there. And Eustace says that he had considered some kind of ritual, but figured Aslan would not like that very much. And so instead, they just call out to him. And not much later, as they're fleeing from some bullies, they find themselves in the high country of Aslan. Now, right here, right near the beginning, this is surely one of the best exchanges in the book. And so I'm just going to read this. "Are you not thirsty?" said the lion. "I'm dying of thirst," said Jill. "Then drink," said the lion. "May I? Could I? Would you mind going away while I do?" said Jill. The lion answered this only by a look and a very low growl. And as Jill gazed at its motionless bulk, she realized that she might as well have been asking the whole mountain to move aside for her convenience. The delicious rippling noise of the stream was driving her nearly frantic. Will you promise not to do anything to me if I do come?" said Jill. "I make no promise," said the lion. Jill was so thirsty now that, without noticing it, she had come a step nearer. Do you eat girls?" she said. "I have swallowed up girls and boys, women and men, kings and emperors, cities and realms," said the lion. It didn't say this as if it were boasting, nor as if it were sorry, nor as if it were angry. It just said it. I daren't come and drink, said Jill. Then you will die of thirst, said the lion. Oh dear, said Jill, coming another step nearer. I suppose I must go and look for another stream then. There is no other stream, said the lion. It never occurred to Jill to disbelieve the lion. No one who had seen his stern face could do that, and her mind suddenly made itself up. We see very clearly that Aslan is not a tame lion. He is not manageable. He is that which is, and it is only through the right kind of reverence, the right kind of death with the hope of rebirth, that we might hope to drink from the stream of life that he guards, or better yet, that he is. And later on, I'm going to connect back to the Christ waterfall imagery that we get in the Great Divorce, but I'll just let that image sit there silently for now. This right here is one of those passages that is so concrete that talking about it would likely obscure what we're looking at. However, I will provide this passage from Lewis's essay, or really his sermon, A Slip of the Tongue, which is found in the Weight of Glory collection. Now, I couldn't find a PDF of Slip of the Tongue to include. Now, you absolutely need to get the Weight of Glory essay collection if you don't already have that. But for now, I was able to find a recording from the audiobook, and so I'm linking that into the supplemental reading for this week. And so make sure you go back and take a look at that if you haven't already seen that before watching this video. Lewis says, William Law, in his terrible, cool voice, said, "If you have not chosen the kingdom of God, it will make in the end no difference what you have chosen instead." Those are hard words to take. Will it really make no difference whether it was women or patriotism, cocaine or art, whiskey or a seat in the cabinet, money or science? Well, surely no difference that matters. We shall have missed the end for which we are formed, and rejected the only thing that satisfies. Does it matter to a man dying in the desert by which choice of route he missed the only well? And I feel like that right there captures much of the essence of what we're getting there through that exchange. There is no other stream. Your only choice is to come and live, even if you die. Now, on a more autobiographical note, in this passage from Surprised by Joy, Lewis describes his conversion account, which sounds a great deal like what Lucy experienced at that stream. He says, "Remember, I had always wanted, above all things, not to be interfered with. I had wanted, mad wish, to call my soul my own. I had been far more anxious to avoid suffering than to achieve delight. I had always aimed at limitless liabilities. The supernatural itself had been to me, first an illicit dram, and then, as by a drunkard's reaction, nauseous. Even my recent attempt to live my philosophy had secretly, I now knew, been hedged round all sorts of reservations. I had pretty well known that my ideal of virtue would never be allowed to lead me into anything intolerably painful. I would be reasonable. But now what had been an ideal became a command, and what might not be expected of one? Doubtless, by definition, God was reason itself. But would he also be reasonable, in that other, more comfortable sense? Not the slightest assurance on that score was offered me. Total surrender, the absolute leap in the dark, were demanded. The reality with which no treaty can be made was upon me. The demand was not even all or nothing. I think that stage had been passed on the bus stop when I unbuckled my armor and the snowman started to melt. Now the demand was simply all. Just as we were told that Lucy's mind made itself up, Lewis says that he was not even given the option of all or nothing. The demand was simply all. He called to God because God had called to him. And that leads to this next exchange. I was wondering, I mean, could there be some mistake? Because nobody called me and Scrub, you know. It was we who asked to come here. Scrub said we were to call to somebody. It was a name I wouldn't know. And perhaps the somebody would let us in. And we did, and then we found the door open. You would not have called to me unless I had been calling to you, said the lion. So there we have it. Aslan takes priority here, and we see something of Lewis's theology pretty clearly coming out, that just as his own conversion experience, he recognizes that he only adopted the faith because Christ had first adopted him. And so just as there is divine prerogative in creation, there is divine prerogative in recreation. And I think that that's beautifully portrayed here through this exchange. Now, and I'm not going to read all this, but we need to talk a little bit about this theme of recollection that runs really throughout this story. And so up in the clear air of Aslan's country, one can see clearly, think clearly, and know things as they are. And that's what Aslan says. He says that up here you're able to think clearly, but once you go down below into the low country, things are going to become a lot more foggy. You're going to be prone to forget. both pleasures and terrors can work to this end of leading you to forget, causing you to forget that which you most know to be true, those rays of light that ought to lead you back to the source of light, even light itself. And there's definitely something of Plato coming through in the way that Lewis is framing this. Let's take a brief look here at the Phaedo, one of Plato's dialogues, which details the death of Socrates. And one of the dialogue partners says, "Your favorite doctrine, Socrates, that knowledge is simply recollection, if true, also necessarily implies a previous time in which we learned that which we now recollect." Now, Plato believed that all true knowledge is recollection, that we in some kind of pre-incarnate state had unmediated access to the forms, the true realities which we only see as shadows down here in the lower world of matter. In our attachment to matter, we tend to lose our way. We forget the reality of justice or love, the ideals of justice or love, or even what it means to be human, or any other true essence of reality, and we instead are clouded by disordered passions and earthly-minded thinking. For the true wisdom-loving philosopher, death is an entryway back into this higher plane of existence, where we know that things as they truly are. Now, if you don't already have a background with Plato, and that didn't necessarily click with you, then that's okay. I think that at least just having that Platonic connection here with what's happening in the story is probably sufficient for now. But if you want to learn more about this, then just make sure that you sign up for the Brief History of Ideas course that's coming up in a little while. And we'll spend some more time on this. But know that for Plato and for Jill, the pathway to fulfillment is an uphill process of remembering that which you learned in the high country, in this higher plane of reality. And it should also be noted that while she's en route to Narnia, she falls asleep, which is a kind of forgetfulness, a signal that she is incarnating, so to speak, into the Low Countries. And we see again and again how especially comforts seem to keep her from remembering the signs, that she gets distracted and she focuses on lesser goods, mistaking them for ultimate or higher goods. And so they're in Cair Paravel and everything's going really well. And so this is when we're told that she's forgotten about the signs and the Lost Prince. She's forgotten about the signs and she's forgotten about her mission, her telos, her goal, what it is that she is there for. And this just shows us that it does not take much for Jill to lose focus when things seem to be going well. And I'm sure that we know exactly what that can be like. That prosperity, for the apparent blessing that it is, very often can turn into a curse. For more on this, make sure that you read through Boethius, The Consolation of Philosophy. And by the way, I don't think I've ever actually told you who Boethius is, and some of you might not have any familiarity. So Boethius was a Roman statesman who was in Rome shortly after the last Western emperor was deposed. And so he's operating under a barbarian king. He is a Christian, he is a Roman, he is a philosopher, a theologian, and as far as we can tell, he seems to be a pretty good guy. But he was falsely accused of engaging in sedition. He was specifically accused of conspiring with the Eastern Roman Empire to retake the West. And there's no substantiated evidence that he was actually doing this. It seems to be some trumped up false charges that were levied against him. And then he is imprisoned. And so this is a guy who led his life by reason, by virtue. He seems to, at least for a while, think that he did all the stuff he was supposed to do. And he seemed to have fortune on his side because of that. But now, through no fault of his own, his fortune is just stripped away. And so now he finds himself imprisoned, and eventually he's going to be executed because of these false charges. And so the Consolation of Philosophy is really his attempt to work through his relationship with fortune. How do we relate to the moving wheel of fortune that isn't always and really just doesn't seem to be hinged on what we do? How do we find constancy in a world that is constantly moving? And his meditations here, which draw on a lot of classical philosophy, a lot of the Greeks, a lot of the Romans, but brought into a distinctly Christian context, these became so important for setting the foundation for medieval thought, to the point that in The Discarded Image, Lewis said that to develop an appreciation for Boethius is almost to become naturalized in the Middle Ages. And so if you want to get a better understanding of medieval thought, make sure that you read The Consolation of Philosophy. And also, of course, make sure that you enroll in the Life, Death, and Meaning with Beowulf and Boethius course that is coming up very shortly. But now, back to Lewis. Now, Jill and Eustace get swept away into this parliament of owls, and this is where they learn about what happened to Rillian and how his mother was killed by a serpent and how he was lured into, or rather he was lured by this apparent beauty, which is obviously a bewitching siren, who is the serpent that killed his mother. Now, here we get some imagery of sirens as well as flavors of various serpentine myths. Of course, there's Medusa, who turns men into stone, or in this case, a bewitched image of a man. And then, of course, there is Eurydice, the wife of Orpheus, who was bitten by a serpent and became Orpheus's cause for going into the underworld, where he muffed the directions he was given. And so I don't think that there's any one myth that Lewis is pulling from here, but rather he's pulling in a variety of myths of seduction, of death, and underworld recovery. Some of this has already happened in the story, and some of it is being anticipated. Oh, and owls are obviously significant as well. They are nocturnal creatures, and so they carry the lunar influence that will set them to travel. And remember that there were these owl creatures in Ransom Stream in Out of the Silent Planet. As the lunar creatures, these are signifiers that things are about to change, things are about to move into a kind of transition. Now, let's talk just very briefly about Puddleglum. Now, Eustace and Jill are easily pulled into the Green Lady's promise of comforts with the so-called gentle giants. But Puddleglum quarrels with them because he has no real hope of earthly comforts. Puddleglum is often seen as a pessimist, but that really isn't quite right. He is someone who has forsaken all earthly goods as if they were lost to him, but he does not do this out of depression, but out of surpassing faith in the eternal goodness of Aslan. And so, to a comical degree, he always assumes fortune will be bad, but he's entirely okay with that. He is lion-hearted. Now, eventually the heroes find their way into Underland, where many fall down and few return to the sunlit lands. This Underland is surely a stand-in, or a mythological relative of the underworld, of Hades, the place of the dead. They are going, with Psyche, to recover beauty, or that which is chiefly valuable, from the Lady of the Dead. Now, there's this interesting exchange between the heroes and the bewitched Rillian. They mention how they saw the lettering in the old city that said, "Under me," and Rillian laughs at them, and he says that this used to be a longer message, but that the other letters had eroded away or had been used for other building projects. And so Rillian seems to be saying that they did not receive a providential message from Aslan because the supposed message was the effect of natural events. Thus, it was nothing more than an accident of history. And this is a demonstration of the nonsensical idea that providing a mechanical historical cause of a thing discredits a metaphysical and perhaps even eternal narratival explanation. G.K. Chesterton gets at this pretty well. He says that someone could ask you why a kettle of water is boiling on the stove, and you could say that the water molecules are heating up and bouncing around. Or you can say that the water is boiling because you're about to make some tea. Both explanations could be true at the same time. One does not negate the other, and that is Puddleglum's point in saying there are no accidents. Our guide is Aslan, and he was there when the giant king caused the letters to be cut, and he knew already the things that would come out of them, including this. And I just think that this is a great quote to demonstrate the northern heroism that we see in the Silver Chair, especially from Puddleglum and then from the freed Rillian. Puddleglum says, "Aslan didn't tell Pole what would happen. He only told her what to do. That fellow will be the death of us once he's up, I shouldn't wonder, but that doesn't let us off following the sign." And so this is just a great example of the northern spirit, which says, I am going to fight with the monsters, even if the monsters kill me, and everything else in the end. Our task is not to fret over what will happen, but to act in obedience with the time that is within our control, namely the present. We see this several times from Puddleglum, and then also we are going to see this, as I said, from the freed Rillian. Now, next, the bewitched Rillian convinces them not to untie him from his chair when he goes beastly, which of course is actually the time that he is sane, although he's still raving, as you might expect in that kind of desperation. In any case, the heroes are not initially convinced that the true Rillian was now speaking, until he mentioned the name of Aslan, which was the final sign given to Jill. They debate a bit, and then decide to set him free, but we get this great line, "Yet could Aslan have really meant them to unbind anyone, even a lunatic, who asked it in his name." Now, first, it should be noted that he is called a lunatic, which of course is associated with Luna, and the lunar influence that pervades this book. Remember that Luna is involved in change, in transitions, and Rillian even sits on the silver chair, silver being the metal of Luna. But in this case, he is actually transitioning from insanity into sanity, and this is connected with the name of Aslan. Aslan is the constancy, the anchor, the solid ground in a world of change. In fact, echoing what Puddleglum said just a bit ago, Rillian will soon declare that Aslan is their good lord, whether they live or die. Earthly life is not constant. It is fading away, and will come to an end at some point, whether several years from now or this very moment. But Aslan and his kingdom are constant, and that is where they can place their hope. And it's where everyone, even a lunatic, can find stability. And now, here it is. This scene is really the climax of the story. This is the pinpoint that everything has been leading toward, or this is the clearest picture of what we've seen all along. The heroes are being led by the Queen of Underland to forget that which they know, that which they have experienced. They are being gaslit into thinking that Underland is the only world that has ever been, and that their experience of the upper world is nothing but a dream or a vain imagination. I think that this is so well done, and it's one of my all-time favorite chapters, at the very least in modern books. But looking through the enchantment of storytelling a bit, we ought to note that this is directly tied to Experiment House, where the story began. And in fact, this is Experiment House if you have the eyes to see it, or at least it is of the same spirit. Both are driven by decontextualizing cosmic realities. They are an attempt to manipulate and control and cut people off from the transcendent realities that we all inescapably know when we are thinking clearly. This is the school of Gaius and Titus. This is one of the experimental schools propped up by the likes of Devine, or rather, Lord Featherstone. Lewis is not only giving us a captivating story, although he is doing that, he is providing a scathing criticism of modern thought. And remember that in The Abolition of Man, Lewis points out that modern science and magic are twins, born of the same impulse of domination through cosmic isolation. It is an attempt to reign in hell rather than to serve in heaven, and that results in radical isolation from God, from others, and from self. Yet, we know that this is not real. We know that there is such a thing as morality, as justice, as love, as truth, goodness, and beauty. We know because we have been to the high countries, or maybe in a more precise way of speaking, we inescapably know that there is a high country, and that is where we belong, and that all goods in this world are baubles that have trickled down from that mountain. They are not the entire story. To think that they are requires bewitchment, and that is what we see in Underland. And that is what we see in empty progressivism done for the sake of progress. Now, as this bewitchment starts to take effect, the heroes know that they have seen the sun, and so they're trying to argue their way into belief or confidence in this external reality. And so they know that they've seen the sun, and the witch replies by suggesting that they have only seen the lamp above them, and then use their imagination to magnify it into something extraordinary, and indeed, perhaps even nonsensical, within their model of current empirical experience. She then does the same thing with Aslan, arguing that a lion is just imagined out of their experience of an ordinary cat. Again, she is attempting to reduce all knowledge to present empirical experience. Now, if they were going to engage in a philosophical debate, then perhaps they could say that if the Queen was right that there were no transcendent realities, then there isn't even any reason as to why they should accept what she is saying, because should accept, shouldness, operates in a metaphysical realm. There is no scientific experiment that can be run that would demonstrate that science is the only pathway to truth, or even a pathway to truth, and so it is self-defeating as soon as it is proposed as something that ought to be believed. The German analytic philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein said that if you were to compile all material facts, which is the only kind of facts that he and other empiricists allow, if you were to compile all possible material facts into a book, then you would not find one ethical statement about what ought to be. Now, he tried to be consistent with this, and he said that this means that ethics, at least in its traditional framing as what one ought to do for the sake of goodness, he said it's an illusion. He said it's a misuse of language. And, I mean, of course, surely nothing can go wrong with an early 20th century German saying that there's no such thing as absolute ethics, right? And of course, the answer to this question is exactly why there are a few times in Lewis's stories, and really explicitly in That Hideous Strength, when Lewis takes this philosophy, which was gaining popularity in England, and he says that it was starting to seem like they had lost the war. Ideas have consequences, and if the Queen would have her way, this is what we would get. Never forget that Lewis does not only tell stories. His stories always have objectives in mind, and he has his scope set here at the same set of ideas that he's been aiming at all along. However, this is not going to be a philosophical debate. As G.K. Chesterton says in Orthodoxy, curing a madman is not arguing with a philosopher, it is casting out a devil. This is a very Perelandra moment, as Ransom realized that words were not going to win the fight against the unman. He needed something more concrete. It would mean fighting. So too, Puddleglum saves the day not through disputation, but by taking a stand. He is a concrete object in the vaporous underworld. He is a substantial spirit in the midst of ghosts. He takes a stand, which leads to the witch showing her true serpentine form and getting her head cut off. And there's a lot of strength in this scene, and there are many things that we could say about Puddleglum's speech. Now, first, it very much reminds me of Mark Studdock when he is told to deface the image of the crucified Christ. Mark sees what the bent, forces like Bellbury, does to the straight, and he decides that even if he's not sure that there actually is a straight, he is on the side of the straight. It also makes me think of what Lewis says elsewhere about faith being a holding on to something in the dark that you once saw in the light. Also, in Myth Became Fact, he says that someone who believes in the myth of the gospel may be in a better position than someone who accepts only the fact of the gospel but is not moved by it. And now, of course, Lewis would argue that you need the fact of the gospel too, but the point is that faith is what moves us, it's what animates us, it's what orchestrates our passions. But more than anything else, I think that what Puddleglum shows us is the strength of simply being substantial. We need to be something more solid than words if our words are going to mean anything at all. And teaching on a public college campus, I can attest to this. Students are often thrown off and often find it refreshing when I make solid statements about truth and morality. They are so used to hedging everything in the obscure language of personal opinions that they sometimes don't know what to do when I make a statement as if I actually believe that it's true. Our world is hungry for this. Our world is hungry for contact with reality, and we can provide that contact through our own persons as we are situated in substance, as we become substantial in a world of phantoms. Now, after the queen dies, they eventually make their way out, and Rillian sees his father just in time for him to die. And then they are whisked away to Aslan's country, where they see Caspian brought back to life, or rather we see him enter into life itself. And there's some great sacrificial crucifixion imagery here, as the blood of Aslan moves into the stream and gives life to the king, who is no longer an old man, but is now ageless, much as the spirits of the Great Divorce and Ransom in that hideous strength. And this imagery of Aslan flowing out to bring life reminds me of the Christological image that we get in the Great Divorce. With an appalling certainty, I knew that the waterfall itself was speaking, and I saw now, though it did not cease to look like a waterfall, that it was also a bright angel who stood, like one crucified, against the rocks, and poured himself perpetually down toward the forest with loud joy. And I don't feel a need to say much about this, other than that I think that it is a powerful image that, at the very least, rhymes with the image that we get here in the silver chair. And then this is another great exchange that I have to highlight. "But," said Eustace, looking at Aslan, "hasn't he died?" "Yes," said the lion in a very quiet voice. Almost, Jill thought, as if he were laughing. "He has died. Many people have, you know. Even I have. There are very few who haven't." This exchange really gets the idea that death is universal, but that it's not a universal end. For some, it is just the beginning. As Psyche says, "Death opens a door out of a little dark room, that's all the life we have known before it, into a great real place, where the true sun shines, and we shall meet." Next, Caspian asks Aslan if he can look into their world, and he asks if this is wrong. And Aslan says, "You cannot want wrong things anymore, now that you have died, my son." And here Lewis really inspires us with this profound sense of longing for perfection, when our desires are no longer bent. But also, this gives us a lead up to the concluding act of the story. Now, in this scene, and I won't read all of it, but Aslan launches a mini crusade against Experiment House. He opens a door to the school, and Caspian, Eustace, and Jill are presented as these ancient medieval heroes, and they strike the students, and Aslan reveals himself, or at least his backside, to the head of the school. And notice the capitalization there. And this sends the head into hysterics. And I really think that this is a child-sized portion of Banquet at Bellbury, as those progressives who seek to refashion man are sent into hysterics, by ancient heroes, and a lion, an untamed lion at that, a wild lion, makes a sudden appearance, and this leads to a head being removed. Now, unlike in That Hideous Strength, the head is not consumed by the wild animal, if for no other reason than this is a story designed with kids in mind, but the essence is still there. In this case, the head actually finds her way into Parliament, where she excels at being useless, which of course is just a nice satirical touch. Also, I should note that Lewis got this idea from his first attempt at a sequel, or I suppose a prequel to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. After that book was published, Roger Lancelin Green asked him how a lamppost came to be standing in the Narnian woods, and so Lewis sent out to write a book that would answer that question. The basic premise would eventually become The Magician's Nephew, but in this early draft, Lewis began to talk about Diggory's aunt, writing, quote, "His aunt, whose name was Gertrude, was not at all a nice person. Years ago she had been a schoolmistress and bullied the girls. Then she became the headmistress and bullied the mistresses. Then she became an inspector and bullied the headmistress. Then she went into Parliament and became a minister of something and bullied everybody." And so obviously we see that idea playing out here at the end of The Silver Chair. Now before we end, I want to say something about Father Time, who the heroes found sleeping in Underland. This is a strange find, but it's surely significant. We're told that he sank into the Underland, where he lies dormant until he will rise at the end of the world. And I think that Lewis is telling us here something about time and about true beginnings. At the moment, time is sleeping, time is ambiguous, progress is ambiguous. We talk about moving forward, about the march of history and all that, but true reality is eternal. Remember, as the George MacDonald character said in The Great Divorce, heaven is what remains when everything is shaken. And so Lewis believes, and of course I do as well, that progress can only really occur as the temporal and eternal are united, or better yet, as the temporal is caught up into the eternal. In other words, we do not increasingly create the ideal. It's not manifested through the movement of history, as some kind of world spirit philosophy might give us. But we rather long to live in the ideal itself, in the fullness of what reality is meant to be and what it truly is. Remember that evil is a privation or a lack. It's a movement away from goodness. And so that which is most real is good. And once we come to find that reality and come to be real ourselves, well, that is the true beginning. Remember this exchange between Ransom and Tor on Paralandra as they're talking about what we're prone to call last things. Most of them, said Ransom, have ceased to think of such things at all. Some of us still have the knowledge, but I did not at once see what you were talking of, because what you called the beginning, we are accustomed to call the last things. I do not call it the beginning, said Tor the king. It is but the wiping out of a false start in order that the world may then begin. Lewis is just planting this seed here that is introduced and then left behind, that Narnia's true beginning is on the way. But that is where we will leave off for now, as we go further up and further in with The Horse and His Boy. Until then, Godspeed.